Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author and English teacher on summer break, getting to read a lot and enjoy a lot of different chats with authors. And on this week's episode, I have Christopher Barnes, and he's going to be talking about his book, Mesa Verde's Secret Garden, A History of Managing the Backcountry and Wilderness of a National Park. Christopher, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, DelSheree. As you said, my name's Chris Barnes. It's nice to be back here. I worked for the BLM in the Farmington office during the 1990s and went from there to Montana, where the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center is located, and I was part of an interagency team that traveled around the country teaching people how to best steward wilderness. And when I retired, I came back down to the Four Corners because my wife and I just loved it here and ended up living just opposite Mesa Verde National Park, where the superintendent at the time had been a trainee of mine in the very last course that I did for the Carhart Center. And I asked him if there's something I could do as a volunteer for the park that would take use of my expertise. And through a series of things, the book came about. It was starting with the idea that I could help with their wilderness character monitoring, and I looked at what that meant for the park, which is unusual because it's the only terrestrial park that does not allow visitation in its wilderness. And looking into that and some of the other issues that came up in the course of my research, I thought this makes for an interesting story. So the book is about how the area is managed, not so much about the archaeology. There are wonderful books about that. And it really starts in 1906 when the park was designated by Congress and ends with an exploration of what might come next for the park.
Well, and this was one of the first parks that was designated because of cultural resources rather than Yosemite and things like that, where the land itself is amazing and needed to be preserved. Yes. This had a different focus, which has really kind of complicated its management over the decades.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it was the first national park that was designated for cultural resources. There had been a monument before that had been Casa Grande, but this was the first national park, and for a long time, there seemed to be a dichotomy between the natural parks that you mentioned, like Yosemite and Yellowstone. And people would say, well, there's nothing scenically beautiful about Mesa Verde. I would disagree with that.
I think there is.
But certainly not on the grand scale of the huge national parks. And it's relatively small. It's just a little over 50,000 acres. So that was an interesting dichotomy over time. Interestingly enough to me, when the first idea of wilderness was proposed in the country in 1919, Arthur Carhart and Alda Leopold, who were the two Forest Service employees who came up with this idea, were quite insistent that wildernesses did not need to be scenically attractive. That was not the idea behind wilderness. And I mean, I happen to think that Mesa Verde is beautiful, but a lot of people think, well, it doesn't compare with the places that you've mentioned.
It's interesting because living here in the West, we have a lot of open space. We have lots of federal lands that are open and people, even just here, most of this area of the country is open and it's not very populated.
Yes.
But that's not the case in a lot of other areas where the idea of having a place set aside for solitude to get away from modernity, that is kind of an exceptional thing that people don't have as much access to if these lands aren't set apart. And that idea of wilderness, I was thinking about it as I was reading, where it's like, here where we live out in the West, you can go, 50 feet from your house and find an area of isolation. But that's not the case. This is kind of unusual for this area to have that. And so the idea of wilderness, of places throughout the entire country being set aside as places of solitude and being able to get away from people and machinery and all of that, it might not seem, I guess, maybe as important when you have that all around you, but that's not the case for most people. So this is an interesting concept. When it was first initiated, and it sounded like there was quite a bit of pushback to the idea of wilderness as well.
There was, and it's not just about the recreational aspects of going to a place for solitude and that kind of contemplation. Also key to the idea of wilderness is that a place is, that the act uses the word untrammeled, which means basically that it's not managed, where they're letting nature manage it. And there's, particularly at Mesa Verde, pushback because, well, it's been managed for thousands of years. And wilderness isn't about how it was managed in the past, but how it will be managed going forward. And that makes for an interesting dynamic at Mesa Verde. And in fact, in all that part of Colorado, 1,000 years ago, more people lived in what is now Montezuma County than live there now. uh, so it's an amazing experience, too. One of the things I did for Mesa Verde was do an inventory of the backcountry for its wilderness characteristics that Congress had directed the park to do in 1976, and they hadn't got around to it until I offered to do it in 2017. And my wife and I got to wander around in the backcountry of Mesa Verde, which is closed to the public, which was an astonishing experience.
I can imagine.
Just being in that environment was amazing. It was amazing.
Well, and for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the terminology, can you kind of go between what would be considered front country, back country, and wilderness, and why they're separated out?
Okay. Yeah, front country is, for the most part, the place where it is developed for the visitor, for visitation. That would include things that might, there might be restaurants there, there'd be paved trails, things like that. Backcountry is generally, Mesa Verde is an exception. Backcountry is open to visitation, but is without the amenities that you'd find in front country. Wilderness is different in that it is designated by Congress, or in the case of the Bureau of Land Management, there are wilderness study areas, which Congress said, look for these areas and manage them so that the place is unimpaired until we get around to designating it or not designating it. And wilderness, we've already talked about the idea of it being untrammeled. It needs to be natural, or as natural as it can be, undeveloped, without the kinds of front country developments, although trails are appropriate, but otherwise undeveloped. And that it has an outstanding opportunity for either solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. There can also be other attributes there, and in a place like Mesa Verde or other wildernesses in the Four Corners, there certainly are. The cultural attributes are not necessary in every wilderness, but where they're present, they have to be managed just as rigorously as any of the required components of wilderness.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because living here in the Four Corners, so many of our monuments and national parks and state parks are cultural.
Yes.
So that seems like a very normal thing that would be a part of it, but that's generally not the case in the rest of the country, right?
Well, I think that's probably true, although why that is not because there were not Native Americans in those places. It's that they left behind less tangible objects. I mean, here, people built of stone, and the stone is still here because it's an arid environment. Whereas back east, people built with wood, and wood rots over the centuries. So that it's not as though there were more people here 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, etc. years ago. That's not the case. It's that the remnants of those people persist and still have great meaning to the people whose ancestors built those places.
And you talk about, in a kind of more later in the book, the difficulties of trying to balance these parks as cultural resources with what they mean and how they should or shouldn't be managed according to the perspective of the tribes who are associated with these areas. And that's not an easy balance to strike. And I believe there were 26 tribes associated in various ways with the Mesa Verde area, and trying to get all of those perspectives and bring everyone to the table on how things should be managed. That would be quite the process and a lot of organization to try to make that happen.
Yes, it's very difficult. And for most of Mesa Verde's history, what Native peoples had to say about the area was completely ignored. The park was originally carved out of the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, which in itself was a relatively recent construct. And when it was found that some of the best sites were not in what had been taken from the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, the federal government just took some more. And there was a plan at the time. One of the leaders of the park movement back before the Park Service was established thought that there wasn't enough there to be park quality. And so just suggested there be little enclaves around each of the cliff dwellings and the rest of the land given to the Forest Service. It wasn't like it was going to be given back to the Ute Mountain Utes. So that's there's a long history of that, and I cover the history since 1906 and the relationship with the Utes in the book. But now, one of the things that's very difficult is that, as you say, there are the 26 affiliated tribes. They do not all agree. It would be a grave mistake to say, oh, all Native Americans think alike, or even all Native American governments, or even all of these just 26 affiliated tribes. There are different points of view, and as much as they may conflict with each other, they certainly conflict with the way in which we think about these, well, what we might call ruins, and what they would perhaps consider remnants of their ancestors. And that is an ongoing issue, I think, in the park. How much should these be preserved forever, and how much should they be allowed to go their natural way?
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because I can't remember when it happened, but over in Chaco, there was a section of the cliff face that fell and crushed part of the ruins there. And we were watching something or reading something in the visitor center talking about how, like, there was warning that that piece was weakening and that there was potential to fall. And they kind of went back and forth on, do we take action to bolster it or keep it in place or whatever? And they kind of came to the conclusion that, like, if this is the natural process of time, it's not really our place to interfere. And that's been handled a little bit differently with Mesa Verde, with the one section that, I'm terrible with dates, but fell at one point, and they kind of reinforced it to keep it from falling again. But that area is closed now because it's just structurally unsound.
Yeah.
And
Spruce
so,
Tree House. They've been wrestling with what to do with Spruce Tree House for the better part of a decade. And there has to be there's a decision of, what do we do with these places? Do we try to stabilize everything that we possibly can for as long as we possibly can, or do we take places like, Spruce Tree and Cliff Palace and Balcony House and Square Tower and some of the areas that are out on Wetherill, like Longhouse and Step House? Do we stabilize those and let the rest go, or do we let those go too? And there was quite a lot of pushback from several of the Native affiliated communities to let Spruce Tree House go. I spent quite a bit of the book talking about that in going forward. How do we treat these areas? What is the appropriate way forward when there is disagreement about what should happen there?
yeah, well, because that's not an easy, like, whose opinion has more weight?
Right.
They were there longer, they had, they built more things. Like, that's not an easy calculation to put together, even if you could get opinions from all 26 tribes and then try to put them all together to come to a consensus. That's probably never going to happen, to get a consensus. But then if you're trying to go with balancing out who gave what opinion, and then what do we do with all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very
not easy.
It's not easy. It's very difficult. But the Park Service is to be commended for finally trying.
Yeah.
Instead of just, the we know best. The Great White Father knows best.
Well, yeah, we went.
Yeah.
I think it was last year, the last time we were there, and, like, I've gone to Mesa Verde many times throughout my life, and I remember as a kid going in and watching the interpretive movie, and they would talk, and it was very much that idea of, like, well, where did they go? The missing people, like they just left, and so, like, I grew up with some of those ideas of, like, there were people here drought, whatever the circumstances were, drove them off. And now it's a mystery. Now it's gone. And, over the course of my life, obviously you learn like, well, that wasn't very accurate.
Yes, exactly. It's not really much of a mystery.
Yeah, it's like, well, they moved on, but we have all the descendants still here.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting to see that how much of that had changed. The video is different. Some of the, my mind's blanking, that like the various posters and things, it's not the best word for it, but where things are explained
Yes.
in a more accurate way, where it's like, oh, okay, so they've included thoughts and histories from the people of these areas rather
Yes.
than just taking that high level approach of like, well, this is how we interpreted it.
And they're completely redoing the main visitor center down at the end of Chapin Mesa, which used to be a collection of artifacts. You'd go past a case and here's a whole bunch of jars, and you'll go past another case and here's a bunch of arrowheads and spearheads. And they're in the process of redoing it so that it feels not unlike we think it felt to live on the mesa 1,000 years ago, roughly. A very different feeling than the usual. And, there's something about, you go through and here are these old signs from the 1930s, and that's kind of neat. And the CCC that worked there for most of from 33 to 42, the CCCers were on, that's the Civilian Conservation Corps, had roughly 200 people every 6 months come through the park, and they did all kinds of stuff. Beautiful cabinetry and, for all the displays of all the pots. And it's just, it's nice. But what did it mean to live here is, I think, more important than, oh, isn't that a pretty pot?
Well, it's shifting that experience from here is artifacts from a people who don't exist anymore to an approach of this is a history of this area and the people who lived here, and taking it into today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think with cultural issues in this area and some of the friction that exist, more education and building those bonds between the people who now all inhabit this area is really important. And that is slowly moving in that direction, but
Yes.
it hasn't been the case for
I
a lot
think,
of us.
I think people, I hope that most of the people in the country realize that there still are Native Americans who live here. And I think at Mesa Verde, it's important to convey, and they are working on doing this, that this place still has relevance and importance to the people who do not live in this location anymore, but have, moved on to the various pueblos. Some of them went to live with the Navajo people. I mean, or live there now. It's complicated. It is a complicated relationship between the people that lived on the mesa back in 1000 or 1250 and the people that live in this area, in the Four Corners area today. But just because it's complicated doesn't mean it should be ignored.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so important to understand how an area has become what it is. And we have so many influences in this area, from the Spanish, from trappers and fur traders coming in, and from the various tribes. And just, it's really complex.
It is.
And to just, boil it down to a few dates and wars and things like that, it oversimplifies things, and it doesn't help the people here today bridge some of those gaps or find some ways to resolve some of the conflicts that are still present in this area.
And the mesa is important that way. Mesa Verde, I mean, back in the day, and by that I'm talking about 1,000 to 800 years ago, it was really not important compared with the down in the valleys, which was much better places to live than up on the mesa top. But most of those places are gone, the physical remnants of them. I mean, Yellow Jacket Pueblo is 10 times the size of Cliff Palace. It was an immense pueblo, and much of it is gone. The stone's used as road base for what is now US 491. I mean, that's gone. I mean, and Canyons of the Ancients National Monument, which is 3 times the size of Mesa Verde and has roughly 8 times the number of cultural sites in it, almost none of them were preserved in any kind of way, the way the Mesa Verde places were preserved, simply because they were easily accessible. And it wasn't something that, people paid attention to when they were making roads or building their own houses. Here's some stone that's already been cut. Let's use that to build our house. But it's an important touch. Mesa Verde is an important touchstone now for our appreciation of what went before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that I thought about as I was reading the book, you get into a lot of the history of the individual superintendents and their approaches and how that shifted over time from it being kind of, here you're in charge, and not a lot of checking in, it didn't seem like,
Yes.
to see how things were going.
Yeah.
So it started out more of, it seemed like kind of people there pursuing their personal benefits and interests at times, to a long shift over its history of being more respectful and culturally aware and looking at the educational and historical value to pass on and to preserve to whatever level ends up being appropriate. But it's really gone through a wide range, like you were saying, of like, oh yeah, it's here, but grazing down to, almost nothing in certain areas because that was more beneficial to either the people involved or financially or whatever. So I wanted to ask you just about that shift overall in the idea of what it means to be in charge of and preserve something, because it seems like it's very different now from where it started.
It is, and Mesa Verde. I think that's true throughout the Park Service, but Mesa Verde was kind of in the forefront of that. The very first superintendents have to think. Mesa Verde was designated as a park in 1906. That's 10 years before the Park Service was established. So there was no Park Service then. There were superintendents that were just, they were chosen usually by the senator. They were political appointees. They had absolutely no background in what they were managing. And, we might get to that again. We'll see how that goes. That changed with Jesse Nussbaum, who came in 1921. There was a conscious decision to bring in a professional, someone who had a background in archaeology, and stopped the idea of, I'm going to manage this for my own good. I mean, the son-in-law of the superintendent immediately prior to Nussbaum, I got the name of Jeep. His last name was Jeep. He would tell visitors to go out and plunder the sites and bring him the goods, which then he put in what passed for a museum that he actually believed were his own possessions. That changed with Jesse, and over time there was a definite switch to the idea of let's manage this area for what the superintendent believed was the good of the country. And for a long time, superintendents, not just at Mesa Verde, but around the system, had pretty much carte blanche. They could do what they thought was best, and most of them did what they thought was best for their park and the people, but their idea of who their public was a narrow one, much narrower than it is today. And there is now, I think you find at the park, the last few superintendents have been very much concerned, not just with what they think ought to be done, what they think is best, but what the people writ large believe is best for that area.
And that's trying to put it nicely. Like, for someone who's put into place those early superintendents, and this is not something that's like a thing that they're passionate about preserving and managing and all of that, to just say, like, you're in charge of this plot of land and not have a lot of oversight. It's impressive for the ones who took that seriously and did a good job, because it seems like human nature kind of lends toward do what's best for you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think, in my opinion, there is no question that the people who work for the National Park Service now are professionals. They do this because they believe it is important and they believe in what they're doing. And even though some of them may disagree with me about how, say, Mesa Verde ought to be managed going forward, they believe in what they're doing. It is not something that they're doing because, well, I might as well have a job, and this one's good because he really doesn't pay all that well, and there has to be a love of the resource, whatever that resource is. And I think that has certainly been evident in my interaction with the staff at not just Mesa Verde, but other public lands in my previous job. And before I retired, that's what I did, is I went around trying to get people to steward wilderness areas properly. And the vast majority of people wanted to do that as well as they possibly could.
And we do have much more to talk about with Chris Barnes about Mesa Verde's Secret Garden, but we are going to pause here and pick up next week as we continue with part 2 of our interview. But in the meantime, you do have some plans for being able to interact with the public with a book signings coming up in this area and other activities that you have planned. So tell us a little bit about your upcoming book signing in Farmington, and then if you have others planned as well, please feel free to mention those.
Well, I've done the ones in Cortez and Durango, so the one that's left in this area is here in town in Farmington at Quill & Quest, a relatively new bookstore on West Main, 218 West Main, and I will be there on Saturday, June 21, at 1 o'clock, and I'll do selected readings from the book, and then answer questions. And for those that want to buy a book and have it signed, I will have a pen.
Awesome. Well, and for people who maybe aren't able to attend in person, where else can they find the book and find you and reach out if they would like to?
Okay, well, Quill & Quest will have extra copies. I think Amy's as well. If people know Amy's, a great used bookstore. I think they will have some copies as well, or certainly can get them. And if people want to reach out to me, they can at my email address, cvbarns@gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to not only come down and chat with me in person, which I don't get to do very often anymore. Most of the time it's on the phone. But for sharing your book and taking the time to chat for so long and really just dig into this really interesting, fun to talk about topic. I appreciate it.
DelSheree, thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me down here.